most merciful, most compassionate. We will begin our session. Professor Ali Mazrouei says that Sudan is more than any state it gives Arab nationalism its African distance because of its geographic expanse from Egypt to the middle of the African continent. So this is why the letter of the first of the U.S. ambassador to Yemen, who received a letter, really delineates this important strategic position of Sudan. The letter states that Sudan's standing with the other group, with Russia, really is a great coup to the U.S. in Africa and the Middle East. Moreover, it is natural that Khartoum is one of the spots of Richard Nixon's tour while he was promoting to what was known later as the Eisenhower Principle. On the other hand of the Red Sea, the Yemen also has a strategic position that is no less important of that of Sudan, even more important. And as we know that Yemen really overlooks the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is very strategic. And some say that 30% of the oil of the world passes through the strait. Also, this strait also harbors the great part of Russian trade with the Asian continent. Perhaps the piracy that the Aden Bay and the Somail coast has witnessed in the past years reiterates the importance of this region with regards to international trade. Undoubtedly, the USA, which is a great power in the world, lays great importance on what is going on and the developments going on in Yemen and Sudan. And this is what we will be dealing and highlighting in this session that includes a number of experts who have great knowledge on this issue. And I trust that we will all become more knowledgeable after this session with the information that we will hear with regards to the Arab-US relations. Thank you. We will begin with the lecture of Charles Dunbar, and we will be listening to him over Skype. Charles Dunbar is a lecturer at Boston University. He lived in the Islamic world for the past 50 years. He writes about the Arab world. Mr. Dunbar held a number of diplomatic positions. He was the U.S. ambassador and to the UN ambassador also, and he presided the Cleveland Council for International Relations. He lectured in Simon's University and Boston University for more than 10 years. Mr. Dunbar.
Yes, Charles Dunbar here. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Mr. Denver, we do.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, please, go on.
I cannot hear you. I can hear you, yes. All right, fine. Okay. it's a pleasure to join the Doha conference, and only a bit painful that it is in a medium with which I'm not very familiar, period. But that said, let me carry on. I thought what I would do today would be to draw on intense experience with Yemen from 1988 to 1991 when I was ambassador there, and to discuss what I learned and what I failed to learn at the time about the country and about the US-Yemen relationship. I have entitled my presentation Mutually Assured Failure because it is increasingly my view that the focus of the two countries on security concerns in the short run may be doing more harm than good in terms of the interests of each country in the longer term. May I change to slide 2, please? The short-term focus, and this is my first point, cements what I've called a noxious status quo. I think on this side of the United States, there is too much reliance on the now poster child weapon, the drone, and that this weakens the hand of both. Certainly it weakens the hand of the government of Yemen, and I think it is not doing the United States as much good as we may think it is. That's the first point. And then the second point concerns of what I call an earlier failure of analysis, which I think has helped to ensure the impasse. I don't think that we were aware enough in the late 1980s and early 1990s of the dangers of what I've called low-rent rentierism. And by that I mean simply that Yemen became a rentier state, but without the really staggeringly large rents that its neighbors in the GCC have received, and that this made the long-term prospects for the country's continued development problematic. The third point is about the uprising, about the awakening, which in Yemen went on longer than in any of the other 6 as a non-violent awakening. I think the awakening certainly created the crisis that brought to the forefront Yemen's very deep structural problems, political and economic, but that it certainly did not create or address those problems. And the final point I'd like to make is that Yemen has a long tradition of being able to negotiate. A friend of mine said that Yemenis are very good at conflict resolution because they are not so good at conflict avoidance. And I think that this negotiating tradition has served up till now the interests of all concerned. But it has not addressed the problems of having the elites in the country overcome their interests and um, try to see the need for real compromise and for concessions. May I change to the third slide, please? Going back into the looking at the past for a moment, the late 1980s were was a time when Arabia Felix, Yemen, was indeed Felix as far as the interests of both parties were concerned. I think central to what went on when I was there was, very frankly, the relationship between George H.W. Bush and Ray Hunt, which served the interests of both countries extremely well when I was there, and sort of culminated in the visit of President Saleh to the United States. CENTCOM at that time was also interested in better relations. And Yemen, I think, occupied a place in the firmament of American foreign policy concerns that it had not done in the past. A personal note of mine is that the negotiation which led to the travel of Yemeni Jews, of the freedom of Yemeni Jews to travel like their Muslim counterparts, did a great deal of winning of friends in the United States, and in particular in the United States Congress, for Yemen, and ensured that the relationship remained strong. I mention in particular Congressman Ben Gilman, who was particularly interested in the Yemeni Jews and went on to be chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Yemen was seen as a country that was modernizing, and President Saleh was seen as a modernizer. And I think we perhaps placed more emphasis than we should have, we in the United States, on the fact that political pluralism appeared to be developing. I think President Saleh's creation or fostering of the Islah political party with the three elements that headed it, Sheikh Abdullah bin Hussein al-Ahmar being the head of it when I was there, the Islamist movement in the country and certain business interests meant that the rise of potentially regime-threatening political Islam was diffused and did not appear until sometime much later. Finally, unification seemed to us to be a triumph of President Saleh and of the government of the North in seizing on the difficulties that the South Yemeni regime was facing and fostering unification. So things looked very nice in Yemen when I left in 1991. And I'll now move on, if I could, to slide 4. The regime, the US-Yemen relationship faced a number of crises and survived them for a time quite well. The first, of course, was what was termed by an American official at the time it happened, the most expensive vote that Yemen would ever cast in the United Nations. And that, of course, was the vote against the resolution sponsored and put forward in the United States that force should be used to expel the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Um, we acted very quickly to slash what had become quite a nice little across the board relationship uh, very, very sharply. And Yemen, for a time, was on the back burner. Yet the relationship revived in the 1990s. The United States decided to support President Saleh in in the war against the Southern secession, and uh, uh, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia had lobbied uh, for United Nations recognition of that split. The next crisis was that of the USS Cole being bombed on October 17, 2000. And here we saw a much played out on a much bigger screen what I've referred to as President Saleh's histrionics. That is to say, he was always interested in making it appear that he was not an agent of the United States. Hence, these histrionics carried over into a very poor relationship with the FBI investigators in particular, and this impacted the relationship. However, after September 11, the relationship was revived again because Saleh and his very capable foreign minister and prime minister at various times, Dr. Abdul al-Aryani, moved rapidly to assure that Yemen would be cooperative. And that has continued with many bumps in the road, but nonetheless has continued until the present time. Could I move along to slide 5, please? Now here I speak briefly about the failure of our analysis in the 1980s. As I indicated before, I think I certainly take responsibility for this, did not recognize that President Saleh was authoritarian above all else, that he made concessions during the 1980s as he expanded the writ of the government over North Yemen and ultimately sort of over the south by making concessions when necessary and making a lip service commitment to fostering political pluralism. I think the fact of the modest oil rents that began to flow in the middle 1980s and have continued to flow in since then resulted in a change of mindset. And I don't have personal knowledge of this. I don't know President Saleh well enough to be able to discuss the subject with him, that he could simply go it alone and ensure the loyalty of the army, the northern tribes, and parts of the business community, and avoid concessions to others. And I think that the first very strong evidence of that occurred following the Civil War, when it was clear that the North had won, and the war was in effect punitive. There was not much effort to reconcile with the South, and flashing forward, we see that that problem has continued and now become something that may well divide the country in the future. I'd like to change to slide 6, if I could. Uh, I will say in my own defense that I didn't see many others in the US government uh, seeing as clearly as we should have what the nature of the Yemen government and regime had become. I also make the point that I'm not sure that early analysis, that telegrams from Embassy Sana'a saying that things were likely to come unstuck, would have done much good. The relationship was what it was. Uh, it blossomed under President George H.W. Bush and became reliant on security concerns going forward. Uh, the U.S. interest was, and I think for the foreseeable future will be, primarily in the Gulf and with the GCC. Yemen will remain prominent as it did because of some of the problems I have mentioned. In addition, the rise of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the underwear bomber, and finally, Tahrir Square and the whole question of the Arab awakening. But I think these realities of our interest being elsewhere and of this being a security-based relationship are likely to continue. May I go to slide 7, please, and just make a few concluding points. I would say, first of all, that there were notable achievements recently, both prominent and some so. I salute all who managed the transition of power uh, and the gradual, the slow exit of President Saleh from the presidency, although he remains in a position of considerable strength in Yemen today, and the national dialogue that has followed. National dialogue has been criticized as one in which a Western agenda was put forward, but I know that there are civil society interests in Yemen that do get it and understand what needs to be done. I'm speaking particularly of a conference that I went to of Yemeni business people and intellectuals and former serving government officials as one that I thought took a very sophisticated view of what the Yemen uh, future should look like. Final point I would make is that um, Joseph Nye recently praised President Obama, and as a former diplomat, I heartily endorse Professor Nye's point that President Obama has a policy in which he tries to follow the dictum of the medical profession: first, do no harm. I hope very much that he in the future will make a more careful analysis than I think has been done of the pluses and minuses of the drone program, that the gains to be had, and I would cite as an undoubted gain the, the successful droning of the al-Qaeda leader al-Hadafi in the early 2000s, and certain others have been successful as well. But we need to remember, I think, that the drones have gained a mystique, it seems to me, as a terrible weapon that the United States uses against others, and particularly against people in the Arab and wider Muslim world, and hence any collateral damage will take on a very large importance. Final simple point, and I no longer get paid for figuring out how we do this, but I think we need to do as much as we possibly can in fostering the civil society initiatives that may eventually lead the elites in the country to cooperate. At the moment, the stalemate is not one that hurts, to borrow a phrase from Professor I. William Zartman of Johns Hopkins, and people should recognize that the stalemate is now hurting and that the status quo is no longer acceptable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Demba. If you just hold on for a moment, if we have some questions from the floor, we would like to have the question in English, if possible.
I regret that I could not hear the question very well.
Can you hear?
Yes, I can. It's louder.
Okay.
I'd like it to be a little clear, not the substance, but the quality of the sound to be clearer. But please repeat and forgive me for failing to understand.
I hadn't asked the question yet. Ambassador, this is David Ottaway from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington.
Nice to hear your voice.
And nice to hear yours. I actually was on the trip with Bush when he went to see Ray Hunt in Yemen back in, when in the world was that, 88, 87? Because I was working for the Washington Post then. My question is, okay, drones are causing a lot of collateral damage. What would you propose as a way of dealing with al-Qaeda, which seems to be pretty well dug in the south and the Hadramaut, if not using drones?
Yes, that is a very good question, and one for which I do not have an answer. I am not saying don't use drones. I am saying be very, very careful, obviously, and we are careful, but not just in minimize, well, it is all to minimize collateral damage, but it's not to minimize the collateral damage of a particular strike, but to recognize that that drones are terribly unpopular, and maybe to make a cost-benefit analysis of where we stand after 3 or 4 years of droning, or however many years it is, probably, yes, something like that. How are things going? Are we pleased with the results? Are we any further along in dealing with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? And I think the fewer the number of attacks that happen, the better. And the importance of a particular target should be as high as possible. That is a diplomat's mealy-mouthed answer. But I am simply saying that I think we need to see how to keep constantly in mind how the drones affect our overall relationship with Yemen. And a point that I didn't make, but should have, is that Yemen now really is in a very, very deep crisis as a country, and as a country that is going to become increasingly important, unfortunately, because its misery is likely to rise. I was never aware of there being starvation in Yemen when I was serving there. There is starvation there now. The country, and that despite the oil rents that we all thought were going to do so much good in Yemen. It is a country that is going to compel our attention, not just for the security threat that it poses, but quite simply as a country that could become a failed state.
Any questions? No? Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you. نواصل الآن
So we're going to continue
الجلسة
with this session,
ونبدأ
and we're going to start
دكتور حسن الحاج علي
with Dr. Hassan al-Hajj Ali,
عميد كلية
the
الدراسات
Dean of the College of Economic Studies in Khartoum. He works as a visiting professor in the study of regions in Hong Kong in Southern Korea or South Korea. He's got a master's from Missouri, Columbia, from the United States of America. And also he has got a PhD in political science in North Texas University. He is going to talk about the American policy on Sudan, from foreign policy to domestic concern. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. So this paper is going to talk about American and Sudanese relations during the governments that started in 1989, and this paper tries to summarize and analyze the situations, the main factors that form the relationship between the two countries. And the hypothesis of this paper is that the Sudanese situation, as far as the decision makers in the USA, it is no longer a foreign policy directed concern, but it is a concern of an internal situation. The paper concentrates on three main points, and I'm going to talk about these three main points. The role of Islam, the political behavior, and it includes two main components, is hegemony and also al-muruq. And the third issue is the situation in the south of Sudan. And before I deal with these components that contribute to the formation of the relationship between between the two countries, the different governments in the United States and after the coup in 1989, they have become a source of concern due to the different Islamic slogans that have been lifted in the first days, and also the regional positions and the different American departments and managements have put pressures in order to isolate Sudan. On the 18th of March in 1993, the foreign states or the State Department has listed Sudan in the countries that foster terrorism. And Clinton, on the 13th of November, he ordered or issued an executive order against Sudan, and both Bush and Obama kept these sanctions on Sudan. Now, I would like to talk about the factors that impact this relationship between Sudan and the United States, the role of Islam. So Islam is a component that has a role in specifying the relationship between the two countries, because we have differences in opinions between the two countries, particularly that the Sudanese government in the first years has lifted a number of Islamic slogans and has reflected a kind of an Islamic thinking, and this was apparent in the foreign affairs by Najm, which has part of the national strategy that was formulated in 1992. And as a result of that, a country was open to a number of organizations, and we had the Arab Popular and Islamic Conference. And in the foreign policy strategy, they have concentrated on the role of Islam. That is why the Sudanese government saw that the main reason that led to the deterioration of the relationship between Sudan and the United States is Islam. And when Omar al-Bashir in 1993 was asked about the reasons behind this disparity and disagreement with the United States, he said, it has nothing to do with human rights, nor has it to do with democracy, nor terrorism. The main reason of this disparity with the United States is Islam. This is the vision of the Sudanese government. As far as the American side is concerned, the American administration has a different opinion. And Edward Dejegian says, the assistant to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the United States, he says the following: Islam is not the coming danger, and we should not look at Islam as one entity, one body. So we have to differentiate between the main trends of Islam and the extreme groups of Islam. This is, in brief, the main component. The second factor is political behavior. And I would like to talk about the United States vision vis-à-vis the Sudanese government. And this is the vision of this government. And they have dealt with the Sudanese government as a state that is incapable and that is not willing to rule the country in keeping with a specific criteria or standards. And this comes from, a number of terminologies or concepts such as the failure state and so on. So this is not new to be called all these names in international politics, to be called part of the axis of evil, a rogue state. So this would set up a framework of threats, foreign threats, and also it gives legitimacy to the political options that rely on violence. And the American administrations have expanded their definitions of the rogue state, and they have expanded the use and definition of the rogue state to include how the state deals with its citizens within the borders of the state. And this expanded definition of a rogue state has led to listing Sudan as part of the list of terrorist countries. And the Sudanese government sees that the American behavior, which is based on hegemony, is the reason behind this tension, not only against Sudan only, but also against other weak countries. And also Sudan blames the United States that it is not trustworthy. And after the signing of Nifasha agreement, Abuja agreement, they promised that they're going to lift them from this list of sanctions, but they didn't. The third factor is the south of Sudan, and the Obama administration in particular, and the Bush Jr.'s administration, they have had led to the secession of the south of Sudan. And the American efforts didn't start with the government of they started in the 80s. And there are two main reports, one by Reuters and one by the Foreign Policy magazine also. So the United States was very much interested in the south of Sudan, and this is starting from the report that was issued by the Strategic Studies Center. And the center was the one to set the strategy of the policy with Sudan, and this came after the peace agreement in 2005, and they have agreed that there should be a state with two regimes, and the different administrations have advised Sudan to sign the peace agreement and also to abide by the agreement, including to accept the results of the referendum of the self-determination. I would like to talk about certain main mechanisms that are very important that appeared during this phase and regarding the relationship between the two countries. I would like to start with the special envoy. The different American administrations have used special envoys in dealing with Sudan. During the rule of Obama, there was Christian, Lehman, and Donald Booth. This is the current special envoy to Sudan, because there would be more flexibility by using this special envoy, and this is going to meet two main objectives. It would show to the Americans that the United States is interested in the Sudanese situation, and secondly, it would keep the ambassadorial representation without having an ambassador. And also we have the different support networks. This constituted pressure on the Sudanese government, and in this respect there was the Alliance of the Salvation of Darfur. This is one of the main models of such networks, and this alliance included many people of American people, because they didn't want them to appear that they are representing one faction or one group of people, so they wanted to put pressure on Congress and also on the American administration. The third mechanism is the Sudanese mechanism, and the Sudanese government try to work through regional organizations, either through the African Union or the League of Arab States. And the forces that were deployed in Darfur, they were in consensus with the African Union, and consequently they try to use such a mechanism in order to alleviate the pressures by the United States. And now we'd like to talk about the traits of the relationship between the United States and Sudan. As for the large activities of these networks, so the situation in Sudan has become an internal humanitarian situation or cause or concern, and the different networking that took place, the transnational activists regarding the situation in Sudan, and they started interacting with the Americans inside the United States, and the linking between these two environments has led to the fact that the development of the situation between the two countries has been reflected in the relationship between the different activists inside the United States. So these networks were successful in making the Darfur concern as one of the most important causes in the different forums, and this impeded the Sudanese government for them to be able to move internationally and diplomatically. And this relationship between the two countries have led to the fact that the different groups that are interested in foreign policy are more influential than any structural institutions. And despite the fact that there were references to the importance of Sudan and its role, and also the existence of and the presence of China in Africa, On the other hand, the other networks, they have used a number of values and ideas such as human rights, what we call the human agency. So the role of these human agencies were more important than the structural factors. And the development between the two countries shows that there was transformation and change, and there was a concentration on foreign policy orientation. And the Sudanese government in the early 90s reflected great interaction with the helpless people and against foreign hegemony or Western hegemony. But there was a change that happened in the framework of government in the end of in the late 90s.
The Islamic factors took a secondary role, and the foreign policy became more pragmatic than ideological by the end of the 1990s. And this led to a transformation from the orientation to concentrating on behavior and conduct. But this conduct or behavior of foreign policy is not concentrated on foreign policy, but on domestic issues. By that, the U.S. Government became more concerned with the internal conduct of the Sudanese government, and now the Sudanese government, now the government sees that there are a lot of groups that lobbying within the U.S. government, and now this orientation, this change from orientation to conduct and behavior, linked between domestic and foreign policies. Thus, our foreign policy is no more only oriented to the external issues. There is this parallelism between domestic issues and external issues with regards to the future of the relation, despite the fact that the relation is facing tensions, but this tension really fluctuates up and down according to the fluctuation of the issues that matter between both countries. After the Clinton administration considered that having peace with the South is the key normalization of the relation, or also finding a solution to Darfur will lead to the normalization of the relation. The U.S. administration added a new condition which was expressed by Donald Booth, the special envoy, in a Congress session. He sees that any actual development or progress with the relationship in Sudan really is based on how the Sudanese government deals with its citizens and how it abides by its commitments, and this leads to the naturalization of the relation. And this also is related to the development of the dialogue, of political dialogue, that is having an impasse now, facing an impasse now in Sudan. If this political dialogue continues between the different Sudanese parties, there is a possibility for the relation to be revived. In the end, the Congress, since it opposed any normalization of Sudanese government, the Congress will not accept this normalization unless there is a quintessential change in the regime in Khartoum, and this makes any attempt for normalization or any policy towards normalization will not be successful unless there is agreement between bureaucracies within the United States. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hassan. You exceeded the time allotted by 2 minutes. The upcoming speaker is Abdelwahab al-Afandi. Mr. Abdelwahab al-Afendi will be speaking about America and Sudan and the model Arab-American relation or an expectation to the rule. He is a research fellow in the British Research Center and a fellow in the UK. He has an MA in philosophy from Wales University in Swansea in the UK and a PhD in political science from Reading University also in the UK. Kindly take the floor. Thank you very much. In truth, I want to add to what Dr. Hassan has said. In addition to the academic aspect, I want to shed light on more a practical side. Perhaps I am the only person that was part of the debates that took place on Sudan in Khartoum and in Washington at the same time. And in this context, I would like to add that I was in Khartoum in the beginning of 1991. And I found messages from the US Embassy that asked me to come to discuss my book, The Revolution, that was published back then. And when I entered the embassy, I found a team of diplomats, and we had discussion and a debate over the US policy on Sudan since the path they took during the Mahdi time, and they were not supporting democracy. They did not want anyone to talk to them about Khartoum. This was what their stance back then. So it seemed that the US at that period faced two problems in the relation. There was a conflict between the deputy ambassador who wanted to reconcile with the regime, and he had direct contact with officials, and the remaining members of the team headed by the CIA, the head of the CIA in Khartoum. They complained that no one wanted to talk to them, and they asked me to help them in opening channels and to talk to people. At that time, there was the Sudanese government did not want to talk with the USA, but in the end of the decade, in 1999, when I was talking with high officials, Sudanese officials, about the international situation in the south, and after I finished my talk, one of the officials gave his opinion and said, we see that everything is in the hands of the US, and the solution to us is to have good relations with the US, and the US will help us to solve all other issues. So of course my comment was that this is not true. This is not right, because at that time they had a problem with Ethiopia, a problem with Egypt, with KSA, and also internal problems in the south. And I told them, what do you have to offer the US for the US to accept? But I was surprised after many months that they actually opened channels of discussion with the CIA, and they opened an FBI bureau and the CIA in Khartoum in early 2000, and so what they said was true. The US agreed to help Sudan to help solve its problems even during the Bush administration, and this shows us that perhaps the academic perception might have problems in the analysis. I also was a witness in 1997 in Washington of the important clash between Kandani and Pendergast, and when they really had this great debate about US diplomacy towards Sudan, and they saw that it was that they were not really very harsh in dealing with Sudan, and Susan Rice came from the Security Council and handled the African issue, especially the issue in Sudan, and as we saw, the US foreign policy. faced a crisis with the bombing of the Shifa plant in Khartoum. But as I said, there was a revival and improvement in relation. Also in 1999, I was witness in a meeting between the State Department and Ambassador David Shin. This why he accused the U.S. diplomacy by dealing with Sudan in an undiplomatic manner and not knowing how to deal with Sudanese problems. The conclusion is a question I want to ask. After we ponder the way how the U.S.-Sudanese relation was managed, is it an exception or is a model of Arab relations? Sudan, in truth, is considered on one hand an exception because it might be the only Arab Arab extent that is dealt with in the African department in the Department of State, but in the State Department, sorry, but at the same time, the perception of the U.S. foreign policy towards Sudan and its perception of the Arab world and the Islamic world, as Dr. Hassan said, its problem back then, there was an accusation of Khartoum that it used to export the revolution to the Arab world, and in truth, at that time, Khartoum was a problem to Washington, not only on the Arab level, but on the African level. Bin Laden, they say, was living in Khartoum. Even this might be a mistake of U.S. foreign policy to pressure to get Osama bin Laden out of Khartoum. Khartoum in the early 1990s, when the U.S. Was busy in the Iraq War, it led to the fall of two regimes. One was an ally of the U.S. and one was an enemy of the U.S. And at that time, Washington did not know what was going on, and Washington tried in the last days to find a solution in Ethiopia and called for a meeting in London, but Sudan, in cooperation with the rebels, postponed this meeting until Addis Ababa fell in the hands of the rebels, and consequently this was a great coup for Washington in this respect. Sudan was in the margins of the American concerns in the early 1970s, but in the days of Nueri, it became an ally to Washington for reasons related to the fact that President Nueri gave lip service to the U.S., including signing the peace agreement with the South, and then moved from the U.S. From the Eastern Camp to the U.S. camp and supporting the Camp David agreement and becoming an ally to the U.S. And he helped also in the campaign against Gaddafi and against the regimes that were allied with him. He also served. He also helped the Jews in the end of the 1980s. Sudan played roles, but it was not important, even though it was the country. It was the only country that received the bulk of the American aids. But I believe one of the mistakes of U.S. Diplomacy, and Anderson conceded to that or confessed to that, is that the U.S. did not support democratic experience in Sudan from 1985 to 1989, and also, like the Ambassador Anderson mentioned in his memoirs, in the end, towards the end of his role, before the failure of al-Sadiq al-Mahdi government, the Sudanese government paid to the U.S. government more than the U.S. government paid the Sudanese government, Sudan. became a donor to the US, and even though it is one of the poorest countries in the world, but at that time there was no importance given to democracy. But the surprise later on is that when Sudan fell under the reign of a dictatorship, the US became more interested in Sudan and pushed the rebels in the south to negotiate with the government in the north, and later on it managed a quasi-Cold War in the region, meaning that it tried in cooperation with Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the neighboring countries, Rwanda also, to uh, topple the regime. But this Cold War ended in 1998 because of the attack. Because the 1997 attack failed in toppling the regime, but in 1998 Ethiopia and Eritrea were warring against each other, and consequently they did not have the means to help in Sudan. And as I said, the security deal took place in 2000, and Sudan witnessed a turnaround on September 12, after a day of the events of 11 September. The US ordered to remove the sanctions against Sudan, and European allies really asked, were very worried and very concerned for lifting these bans and sanctions. But the Bush administration, less than 2 weeks later, presented the decision again to the Security Council, and this led to the lifting of the sanctions that were imposed on Sudan in 1996 after the assassination attempt of Hosni Mubarak. So apparently the relations became better, as we know that the US, of course, contributed actively in the Nevasha agreement. But before this agreement was signed, the Darfur conflict worsened. But for the Sudan, the US wanted Sudan to be united, and this is why the US had to support Sudan in order to promote development and stability. But because of the crisis in Darfur, there was no ability or capacity to provide such a support. Hence, what happened took place, and now the crises in the south are part of such decisions. The main question, or the pivotal question here, is that with regards to the US foreign policy towards Sudan, Dr. Hassan said that the role of the NGOs and civil society and play a role here in this respect. Sudan is the mirror image of Israel, in a sense that Israel is the only state that the US sees that the state can make no mistake, and there is a strong lobby that supports Israel. And Sudan, for the US administration, also cannot make anything right, and there is also a strong lobby. It was strong, at least during the days of the South, like some of you know and perhaps have read. Now this lobby is even greater in the days of Darfur. Like Rebecca Hamilton has mentioned, diplomats said that if we wanted to find a solution in Sudan, we have to go to the Safe Darfur group and give them requests, and a few days later we will get what we want from the Congress. So now the lobbies are managing the foreign policy, the U.S. foreign policy towards Sudan. Now the U.S. administration does not have much to say with regard in this respect. And now we go back to the question that we started with: is Sudan an exception or a rule? On one hand, it is an exception because the US administration is managing this issue with regards from the Afandi part, and there are a lot of lobby groups who are not giving the US administration any opportunity to revive a relation. The three candidates, Obama, Clinton, and the Republican guy, is saying, really issued a common statement on Darfur, meaning there is no disagreement on Sudan even in the presidential campaigns. Also during the administration in the beginning of 2002, in the beginning of 2006, the administration in a Geneva meeting presented a document to give Sudan the roadmap to normalize relations. The candidate, Clinton, back then opposed the Bush administration and considered that they should not deal with Sudan in such a manner. So it is truly an exception. There was, despite the interest of the American administration in Sudan, and this perhaps they want to do something, but they cannot do anything. Exactly, this is exactly the case with regards to Israel. There are certain policies that might harm Israel, but the administration cannot do anything about them. But on the other hand, Sudan is also a model of Arab relations, Arab-US relations, because it doesn't have friends. This is a point. At the same time, the amount of mistakes committed by the Sudanese government, if we do not want to say crimes, does not allow officials in Washington to take action. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdelwahab al-Affandi. لا أعلم لماذا الحكم لا يستمتع بالمباراة لأنه يتابع مراقبة ساعته. The next speaker is Dr. Mohammed al-Affandi, who is the director of Strategic Studies Center and also professor of economy in Sana'a University, and also he's member of the Shura Council or Consultative Council, and also he was an MP in Yemen. He got a PhD in economy from Colorado in the United States of America. And he's going to speak, Mr. Mohammed al-Affandi is going to talk about the parameters of the Yemeni-American relationships. Thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers. So the paper that I'm going to present is going to talk about the relationship between the United States and Yemen, and I'm going to talk about 7 decades and 3 main phases. I'm going to talk about the phase of the Cold War, and after that, the aftermath of the Cold War in the 90s, and the last phase, which is the Yemeni Spring. I'm going to deal with the main issues that are in keeping with the time allocated for this talk. And my paper includes so many details, and I would like to start by saying that the main hypothesis of this paper says that the relationship between the United States and Yemen was based on the reaction from the part of Yemen vis-à-vis the United States in order to reach a basic level of interests. So the beginning of the relationship between Yemen and the United States, it started economically. We had a number of economic and commercial relationships in the 70s after the Ricard Carli ship left the harbor of Yemen, taking Yemeni coffee, and then the first diplomatic relationship started in 1946, but it was not activated until the 50s of the 20th century. And after the success of the Yemeni revolution in 1962, and after that, we have seen the beginning of the Arab Republic of Yemen. And after 3 months, Kennedy recognized the republic, and there was an attempt from the part of Kennedy in order to solve the problem between the royalists and the republicans, but the attempt fails. So the economic parameter was the basic component of the relationship between the two countries, but the most important phase, economic phase in these relationships was after the discovery of oil, and after that Bush visited Yemen, and he said that the discovery of oil in Yemen is going to establish a partnership with the Yemeni people. So the economic parameter cannot be isolated from the political parameter, especially during the Cold War and after the independence of the south of Yemen. There were two nations of one country, so some of them wanted to keep associated with the socialist power. So this relationship either increases with this group or doesn't. But we can say after 1967, the north of Yemen was closer to the west, and the relationship was, witnessing tension due to ideological problems during the Cold War, and the American administration was given economic aid for them not to be under the control of the Soviet Union at the time. And after the tension increased between the North and the South, and the United States supported the North by a military deal that was financed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So the political dimension was a motivation that led to the establishment of economic relationships during that phase. And the second phase, that started in the 90s after the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the new regime that was headed by the new administration in the United States, and it gave an opportunity to Yemen, and it was a challenge at the same time. So the opportunity, the unity has been speedy as a process. And the opportunity was available for Yemen to be reunited, and the US administration has supported the unity for strategic reasons, because the unity would be much more fruitful for instability in Arabia. The second issue is one Yemen would be able to confront the terrorist activities that have started at the time. During this period, the US administration was supporting the democratic transformation that was taking place. So this support for this transformation was great up until 1998, when the United States' interest was forwarded towards security issues with Yemen, and with the increase of terrorism activities. So the democratic transformation at the time was an ethical and moral issue, and it was supporting any political reforms taking place in Yemen. Since 1998, the Yemeni-US relationships have seen great transformations when it comes to security, especially when it comes to countering terrorism. And this level has developed, especially after USS Cole destroyer had been targeted, which has led to the killing of 11 Marines. So the security dimension was very important when it came to the relationship between the two countries. And after the 11th of September, the relationship between the two countries has increased in importance. And after that, there was an agreement or a partnership agreement in order to counter terrorism. But what is noticed from this partnership, we can say it was not symmetrical because it was Yemen that was subjected to the pressures by the United States of America, and the relationship was not transparent, was not clear enough for Yemenis, and the relationship was personalized, and it was a relationship between the president and the security apparatus whose members were members of his family. I'm going to talk about the third phase, which is the Yemeni Spring and the Yemeni Revolution. And I think that the American position vis-à-vis the situation was based on two hypotheses. So the US administration was setting a number of restrictions, and they saw that Yemen was a very weak country, and any problem would lead to more terrorist activities. And the second hypothesis is that any new regime that would come as a result of the revolution would not very enthusiastic to the American priorities. Based on that, the US administration was very concerned and was very careful and heedful, and they have come up with a number of attempts. So the United States tried to safeguard the Saleh regime in cooperation with KSA by inviting the Friends of Yemen in London for a meeting and to support them economically. But I mean, the most important component was the security component, because they wanted to safeguard the country from collapse. The second component is that the United States, before even the revolution, they tried to find a consensus between the different opposition parties, including the Socialist Party, the Nasralli Party, and other political parties within Yemen, and also the previous regime, because they wanted the dialogue can lead to political reforms that can lead to change in the structure of the regime, and that would not lead to the collapse of the regime. So this attempt also failed, and this has led to the Yemeni Spring in 2011, and the US administration held the stick from the middle. So they were trying to talk to both parties, to the opposition and to government, and invited them to dialogue. And they have tried to develop a kind of a political map that would meet the aspirations of the Yemeni people. And they invited two parties to this dialogue. But the US administration has realized that the revolution would continue, and that the regime has become very weak, and they the US ambassador played a mediation between the previous regime and the revolutionaries, and the US administration was talking about the importance of how to transfer powers and also to meet the aspirations of the Yemeni people. So the adaptation method that was implemented was the GCC initiative that has led to a consensus by the international community, and it constituted a kind of a roadmap that would lead to the implementation of the Yemeni people's aspirations. During this phase, the United States chose to meet Yemen about a number of dossiers. So they were in charge of the military and the security apparatus, and they have started with the restructuring of the military and security apparatus due to the fact that these apparatus are in charge of, counter-terrorism issues. So the American administration, through this transitional regime that would have the same interests when it comes to countering terrorism and terrorism activities. And here I have come to a number of problematic issues that impede these relationships, and a number of questions are being posed by the elites and the general opinion of Yemeni people vis-à-vis the relationship between Yemen and the United States, and how to redefine this relationship in a way that would lead to meeting the joint and common interests. So there was a awareness that the battle against terrorism would impede and disrupt the building of the new Yemeni government. So everybody was aware that they should counter terrorism. But this led to concern from the part of the general opinion, the people, because this war has become an open war governed by a strategy, a game by Al-Qaeda. And the question here to be posed, can Yemen, with its economic and political capabilities, can continue in such a game to no end? This is a question that would remain posed. The second issue, so the continuation of such a battle, and this coincides with other armed groups such as the separatist group and also the Houthis. This would lead to the impediment of any change that might find place in Yemen. And also, there is also another phenomenon, which is the employment of Al-Qaeda members. So we do not have one Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has been used to justify, or in order to pass, or to do some laundering or to do some bad issues by certain regional or international parties. So it is being used as a justification. So Al-Qaeda has always been used, in order to use some racketeering with the United States, with the West. Also, Al-Qaeda is used in confrontation for any change that might take place. And also, the Al-Qaeda is being employed in such a thing as well, politically. So the situation has expanded to the fact that the terrorism has become one of the arms of counter attacks to the Yemeni revolutions. And people do not differentiate between real terrorism and terrorism that is being made up for political reasons. So should there be a comprehensive vision? So these are questions that are being posed and that require from the different observers that they should revisit and see the relationship. We do not want the relationship only on the security level, or to be forced by zero-sum strategy. We have to try to rationalize the relationship for them to be able to reach their common and joint interests. And before I finish my paper, we have to redefine the relationship between the two countries from a security perspective. So it is not enough to talk only about the security and military tools. We have to talk also about the other dimensions, economic and also social and political dimensions. We have to adopt other forms of development, comprehensive and also sustainable development, and also try to go and uproot terrorism, and also look at the other dimensions, economic dimensions, political dimensions, and all this should be part and parcel of a comprehensive strategy. And also the relationship should be a transparent relationship. And this component got the interest also of the Americans. And I remember the Deputy Ambassador Nabil Al-Khoury, he said that the relationship should be very clear and transparent, and also the relationship should be institutionalized, should not be, left to individuals, and should not be far from any constitutional institutions, and it should be constantly appraised and evaluated. And also we have to revisit the use of drones, because such a behavior is not very acceptable, because it is counterproductive, and also it is inimical to the state of Yemen. And also, we have to think about having dialogue with those who accept dialogue, because we have some other kinds of Al-Qaeda, not only the Al-Qaeda that we know. And I have said with Mr. Denver, I said the map of Yemen, the Yemenis have sat and they had dialogue, and they are planning to build a new Yemen. These outcomes are facing political and economic and social challenges and security challenges when it comes to armed groups and also terrorist activities. So is it possible for these challenges to be overcome? Because there is a general, regional, and international consensus that we can overcome these impediments and to try to reach a kind of an agreement for us to be able to have a kind of a stable Yemen in the future.
نشكر الدكتور محمد الأفندي.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad al-Affandi. The time of our session has ended, but since the last session has been postponed for tomorrow, perhaps we can use or take up some of its time to take questions. Omar al-Zubaydi. Mr. Muhammad al-Affandi, you have repeated the same speech that the Yemeni government repeats with regards to the comprehensive plan. I think Yemen faces a much more serious problem than having a comprehensive plan. There is a large corruption with regards to the London initiative and the support of the donor groups. Many projects have been impeded because Yemen did not present them in an accurate manner, and many projects were not implemented accurately. There were embezzlement, financial corruption, and other problems. Many countries have stopped Al-Qaeda to grow in Africa and in Asia. Yemen faces a true problem with regards to blackmailing the countries of the world by supporting military groups. The Houthis were informed by Abdullah Saleh. He allowed them to have weapons. He did not punish them when they killed civilians and officials in the army. And on the contrary, when they were attacking the Yemeni territory, and when they ousted many Yemeni citizens from the Bushbara Wadi and other Yemeni regions, there was a conversation, there were discussions and dialogue with the Houthis, and the Al-Qaeda was given weapons from many military camps. And now we are talking about an international blackmailing process, and this is the most dangerous thing that is going on in Yemen, and this makes the friends of Yemen, especially KSA and GCC countries, to withdraw from the project of supporting development in Yemen. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Dr. Hassan al-Ash'ali with regards to US foreign policy and how it became an internal matter with regards to the issue of Sudan. In general, you highlighted important headlines with regards to Islam and political Islam and the South Sudan issue. But I think that you looked from the perception of the U.S. administration and Sudanese government, but how do you look at this issue from the inside? I mean, the government itself. How does the government manage political dynamism like Wahab has said, the government took failing steps, and this really had external repercussions. And this we can look at it from three main headlines. The first headline, the domestic policy and the issue of state and religion, made South Sudan have a clear stance from continuing in the unification process. I think the position of John Garang from the Khartoum government helped in putting the U.S. foreign policy in a certain place. The second headline is the regional dimension. Many governments helped in the mobilization and in the formulation of U.S. foreign policy in a certain manner. In addition to that, there is a regional dimension that I would like you to speak about: the relation of Sudan government with Iran and the position of the government from Hamas and the state of Israel. Israel also had a role to play with regards to U.S. foreign policy in Sudan. The third headline and the last headline that I would like to discuss is the issue of oil. After the ousting of Shafiron, the Sudanese government succeeded on domestic level in managing the oil, but it brought a main competitor, which is China. How did this affect the formulation of the U.S. foreign policy? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. My question is Dr. Hassan al-Hajj Ali and Dr. Abdelwahab al-Affandi. It is related to the dialogue that was launched by al-Bashir lately in Sudan. What are the backgrounds? What are its repercussions, results, and does the U.S. have any position or role in this respect? Thank you.
سأبدأ أنا أتفق مع الأخ في مداخلته أنه فعلا هناك تباطؤ هناك فساد.
There is corruption. There is evidence stating that the previous regime is behind what is going on. But if you look at the political process, there is a kind of balance, and this balance today allows implementation to take place, but it will be slow. It will take time. The donors, despite of their promises, they are not paying their commitment in a timely manner, and this affects the situation in Yemen. Also, on the other hand, some countries have paid. So, of course, the GCC countries, KSA, Qatar, are really committing and paying their dues. The U.S. administration since 2011 until now has paid around $603 million, allocated $603 million for security reasons as well as counterterrorism projects. But now the transition period is hard because the regime of President Hadi faces many challenges and obstacles and a very hard legacy, embezzlement, corruption, and other things. And he is very patient in dealing with these issues. But with regards to the economic aspect, now there is an agreement between the donors and the government with regards to the transparency and accountability, be it on the donor side or the government side. And now in their last conference, they have divided themselves into committees: political, security, economic, and these committees meet in regular manner in order to evaluate the situation. But in truth, the challenges facing Yemen are terrorist groups and terrorism, and and armed groups as well, but we say that the future map of Yemen is clear. I'm not saying that we failed, but there are challenges, there are obstacles, and the cooperation of regional states, international states, of course, the regional states who are supporting these armed groups, and you know them, of course, but the United Nations Security Council and the international consensus with regards to the political process in Yemen. I think this provides an opportunity for the success of reconciliation and meeting the aspirations of these Yemeni citizens.
طيب في ميل النقاط اللي اثارها دكتور بشوق هبدأ في الاول بقى نيجي تاني موضوع الحوار في ميل موضوع جنوب السودان
With regards to South Sudan and the issue of state and religion,
انا في اعتقادي انه
I believe that
يعني هذه ليست القضية
this is not
المحورية
the
التي ادت
pivotal issue that led to the cessation of South of Sudan. And we have to go back a little bit to the third democratic period after the Intifada and after the fall down of the Emiri of the Numeiri, regime.
لنظام نميري مع انه الجميع يعرف انه نظام نميري
We know that the Numeiri, everyone knew that the Numeiri regime fell apart, but I believe that but there was a certain objective, which is the cessation of South Sudan, and I believe that John Garang was not for the unification, but tactically he brandished the slogan of New Sudan, and that in order to mobilize the opposition in the north.
موجودة في خرطوم لكن genuinely
But genuinely, in my personal opinion,
لم يكن وحدويا اصلا
Garang was not pro-unification,
المسعى بتاع فصل جنوب السودان ما بدا مع الانقاذ
and
في العرض بل
and as I have mentioned, you can go back to two reports that I have published, that I have mentioned, that of Reuters and that of Foreign Policy, which state that in the beginning of the 1980s, the core of the lobby started to work
فصلوا في النهايه
to separate South Sudan from the north.
انا في الغالب دي ذريعه
And I think this is an excuse. The popular movement always use an excuse so as not to reach an agreement with the Khartoum government. Every time they have a different excuse to stop dialogue, to stop the agreement. The other point with regards to regional dimension,
حقت الانقاذ ادت الى استعداء
in the beginning,
خاصه اثيوبيا لاحقا جاءت اريتريا بعد
we did not have good relations with Ethiopia and Eritrea,
السياسه الخارجيه للانقاذ نفسها حصل عليها تغيير
but this policy changed
التسعينات
in the end, towards the end of the 1990s.
النقاش الداير
The discussion that was taking place
قرار
among
انه
policymakers and decision makers
كان بدأ في التسعينات
that the policy that was based on Islam and unification took another turn and became more pragmatic with the increase of pressure.
لكن بعد حصل انفراج
But after that, by the end of the 1990s, we had a breakthrough in relations with Eritrea and Ethiopia.
صحيح يعني مرحليا في التسعينات كان
So in the 1990s, temporarily, there was tension in the relationships, but after the change on the policy of Sudan, this has changed.
موضوع ايران
With regards to Iran,
انا في تقديري انه
in my opinion, the Iran-Sudanese relation
يعني تم تضخيمه
has been magnified regionally,
وفي تقديري انه الولايات المتحده الامريكيه مدركه
and the US knows that the Sudanese-Irani relation are not as important and as big,
هذا يعني
but
ملعوب لوتر اقليمي
this has a original agenda, and that has nothing to do with Sudanese-US relation. With regards to China, we all know that China today
يعني فاعل اساسي في افريقيا
is a main player in Africa.
لا توجد دوله
Now,
ما عندها علاقات قويه مع الصين
no state, every state has a good relation with China. Now Chinese and African relations are growing. Even the report of the Foreign Policy Center with regards to strategic relations in Africa mentioned that we have to take China should be taken into consideration, and the US should agree with China on how to deal with Africa. Now, last year, China gave Africa or Africans 15,000 study grant. So now China really has a strong presence that cannot be ignored, and it is a status quo. So the Chinese presence is now a reality and status quo in Africa. Finally, the issue of the dialogue. Of course, this dialogue has been tackled by Sudanese president, but because the domestic situation has worsened in Sudan, so the only solution was to pave the way for dialogue and to allow the different factions and different parties to take part in this dialogue, except those who are considered as leftists, who had conditions. So the dialogue started really on a bad step, but it is still lagging behind, especially dialogue between the main factions. They did not agree on a constitution and on a political program and a transition period. But hopefully it will become better in the future. Thank you. Before I comment with regards to Sudan, Frank, I think, asked about the alternative in Yemen with regards to drones. I think that the alternative is very clear, which is strengthening the Yemeni government, especially that it's an ally to Washington. And I don't believe that despite what is said, I don't think it has interest in the continuation of terrorism. And so if we strengthen the government, we will be fighting terrorism. With regards to Sudanese issue, in truth, in addition to what has been said, in my opinion, I think the US-Sudanese crisis really sums up the Arab crisis. Most of the problems that the US government administration has faced. It is true that there are lobbies, but I believe what Rebecca Hamilton has said and what Dr. Hassan has also mentioned, that there was a small group that called itself the Council, and and they conspired, and I think they really magnified their abilities. I saw Sudan helped in the problems. For example, I was in Khartoum when the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was being discussed. So Sudan really should not have interfered in the Iraq-Kuwait crisis, but supporting Iraq, like what happened, it is a catastrophe to Sudan. In truth, the public opinion was really distraught in the Arab countries, and the government supported Iraq. Hence, the US administration tried to stop Khartoum and to help Khartoum. Herman Cohen in the 1990s started his initiatives to have peace, institute peace in the south, and then we had the Darfur crisis that exploded at the time when the US and the donors opposed or presented $5 million to support peace in the south. The government really institutes a crisis or causes a crisis in Darfur. So many of the policies, or a major part of the policies, like I have mentioned, Sudan did not want to face America. There was a desire to have good relations with the US. But for these relations to be good, the US has its constituents, has a public opinion to raise awareness. There For example, there were a lot of bad publicity with regards to slavery and all of that. There were problems in the South. There was war in the South. There was a lot of transgressions. So it is very difficult for any U.S. administration. There were lobbies, black community, churches, black caucus, and other groups. Now, for example, the U.S. Has criticizes KSA, but there is a lobby that supports KSA, so it really overcomes these problems. But in Sudan, it was complicated. It's true when the oil was discovered in the 1990s, the oil really did not affect the U.S. relations in a direct manner, but rather in an indirect manner, because at that time the SPLA, the rebels in the south, found that at the time, if they do not start negotiations with the government, they will lose the opportunity, because now the government has oil and it is able to export helicopters from Europe, and they might have the upper hand. On the other hand, also the oil allowed the government to present an offer to the rebels. If you agree to have peace, you will have part from the oil, billions of dollars. This also helped the US, but not in a direct manner. What encouraged the US to present an initiative is that the Sudanese government and the rebels became ready to talk to one another, and it played a role in this rapprochement. Thank you. Are there any other questions? So we thank the speakers, especially Ambassador Charles Dumber. And also I would like to thank you for your attention, your patience. I think it's time for a coffee break. Thank you very much.